I recognize quite a few members of AOR in the room. Could you just raise your hand and people can look around to see all of the distinguished researchers here? Thank you. And so we get to hear from 3 of these distinguished AOR members this year, Dorothy Farrar Edwards, Elizabeth Skidmore, and Roger Smith. It is my pleasure to first introduce Dr. Edwards, who was inducted into the Academy in 2012. Dr. Edwards is a professor of kinesiology, which includes occupational therapy program and medicine at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She's also the Associate Dean of Research for the UW School of Education. She was on faculty in the program of occupational therapy and Department of Neurology at Washington University in St. Louis from 1986 to 2006. Her research is focused on development and validations of measures of functional cognition and occupational performance, and on clinical interventions for persons with Alzheimer's disease and stroke. Her presentation is titled, "The Conceptual and Practical Evolution of Functional Cognition and Comparison to the Psychological Construct of Everyday Cognition." Please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Edwards as she shares her inspiring story of her research journey in occupational therapy.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming. I am honored to be here. When I started graduate school in 1972, I never ever thought that I could be with a group like this. And so it's really an honor for me because, as many of you know, I am not an occupational therapist. In fact, Carolyn used to really say, don't say that you're a not, say that you're a hot, an honorary occupational therapist. And so I am an occupational scientist, and I want to share a little bit about my journey and why I think some of this work is really important in terms of integrating some of the principles and constructs of psychology into what we call functional cognition. That's my title, it's too long. Okay, so I was very fortunate. When I was an undergraduate, I had the opportunity, I needed a job. I worked as a nurse's aide in a hospital in Winter Park, Florida. And I was originally on a pediatric floor, and I got assigned to a sort of an acute care floor, and I didn't want to go. I really didn't want to go. I didn't want to be with those old people. I wasn't going to go. And my mother said, well, I don't know how you're going to help pay your tuition if you're not going to go to work. So I went. I loved it. I absolutely had a complete change of perspective, and I knew I wanted to go to graduate school, and I did not want to work with children. And so I did an undergraduate thesis on quality of life in older adults living in congregate housing, and then I was fortunate enough to get to Washington University. I was in the very, very first training program in the psychology of aging. The National Institute on Aging, for those of you who are younger than me, did not exist. We were funded by the National Institute of Child Health and Human Development, and I was in the first group. And I was very fortunate to be there, but I wasn't very happy. And so I was constantly trying to figure out how to get out of that damn laboratory and see people in real life. I did not realize that I wanted to understand occupation. I wanted to see people in context. And so I did my dissertation, but part of my work actually was doing community-based studies. But when I was finishing my PhD, one of my colleagues in the graduate program introduced me to Carolyn. Now, that was a cataclysmic event. For those of you who know Carolyn, you'll understand what I mean. I had never heard of occupational therapy. I was a psychologist. We didn't talk about that. I had never met an occupational therapist. I had no clue what OTs did or what they believed in or what contributions they made. And I met the occupational therapist in the United States, the visionary who really was focused on occupation at a time when the field was moving in other directions. And she needed to write a proposal on an independent living center. And I got volunteered. I didn't know anything about independent living, honestly. I knew how to write proposals, and I worked with Carolyn, and she miraculously got me a job for 3 months that turned into a tenured faculty position at WashU. She changed my life. We are colleagues, friends, collaborators, and we continue to work together, but she changed me. And because of her change to me, I hope I'm making changes in the field. I obviously worked at WashU for a long time, and then I went to Madison, and it's been a really good journey for me. But let me tell you a little bit about my first research experience. So, new graduate students have to do research, and I got sent out to test people in the community. And this was at a time when funding was being made available, federal funding for congregate housing to move older people out of their seemingly isolated homes in the community into congregate settings. And we were modeling this study after the Kansas City Life Study. So I had to test an older woman, and she looked kind of like this. And we did a lot of psychological measures, but this is one of them. This is called the Bender-Gestalt test. And what's really important is that you have to draw this figure from memory, and the lines have to be straight. But the lady that I tested, and I'm really sorry, these are not my most recent slides, but anyway, the lady that I tested, her lines were really wavy. And when I finished testing her, she said, "Oh, those are the bagel bumps." Well, she had a sesame seed bagel, and I put the paper down on top of her sesame seeds. So she looked cognitively impaired, but she wasn't. It was context. And this is I was thinking back about this. This was my first exposure to context and cognition. At the same time that this work was going on, there was a lot of important work going on in the field of aging, and this is really a very, very important model. It was the introduction of the importance of environment on cognitive performance by Lawton and Namahomo. And this is not something that most OT students ever hear about, but it's really important. What I want to really point out is that a lot of what we do is based on work of others. Now, occupational science has moved this work along tremendously, but this is the foundation. Another thing that's really important is that occupational therapy did not discover and did not name instrumental activities of daily living. I know this is a surprise to some people, but it was actually done, again, by Powell Lawton and Elaine Brody in 1970. Well, this one's 1983, but the original paper was actually written in 1968. So this is work that we're building on, but it's really important that we incorporate these constructs into our ongoing work. My next slide isn't coming up. Emily, these are actually not my real slides. Anyway, so we go on. I was able to, with Carolyn's help, get an R01. It was really, for those of you who are used to big money, our first award was $29,000 a year. Remember, Carolyn? Now, out of that $29,000 grant came the kitchen task, the activity card sort, the functional behavior profile. Okay, so it was a gift at the time, and that's when my expertise in measurement and Carolyn's understanding of the importance of performance and understanding performance in context came together to create these measures. Now, the world in psychology was moving at the same time, and there are measures of everyday cognition that look very much, in fact, overlap with our measures of functional cognition. And it's really, really important that we not only know them and acknowledge them, but understand what they're measuring. So there are tests like the IADLC, the Everyday Problems Test, the Everyday Cognition Scale, the Observed Task of Daily Living. Some of them are performance-based tests. We are not the only people who do performance-based tests. Now, there is a really big difference in what we do. So as occupational performance experts, we're looking at residual capacity. We build on what people have. We build structure, we build strategy, we support the environment, we support their family members. Psychologists, and as a psychologist, I'm a deficit modeler. I can tell you what people don't have. I don't actually address what they do have. And so that's one of the big differences between everyday cognition. We're measuring the same thing, but we look at it very differently, and we work with the information very differently. The current papers on everyday cognition, and they're being published today, still use a deficit approach. It's just that they're using everyday tasks to look at it. And so I think it's really, really important to be able to understand the combined contributions of this work, but also to distinguish the unique contributions of occupational therapy and occupational science. Whoops. Emily, I'm stuck again. Am I just not holding it down? Okay, so now I'm gonna introduce really quickly some work that I've done with my colleague Gordon Giles and a postdoctoral fellow who's taking a faculty position at Wisconsin. We've been working with measures of functional cognition for quite some time. And we have developed a screening measure of functional cognition because there was no such thing. And when the Social Security Administration and CMS wanted to mandate basic screening measures, we as a profession had nothing to contribute. And so we started working at that time with a working group and developed the menu test. But I just want to show you that the measures of functional cognition that have been developed by occupational therapists and occupational therapy researchers are every bit or more sensitive to what's really important about the ability to live independently than the traditional psychological screening measures or these other measures that are currently being used today. And this is just an example. This is a paper that was just recently published. And I will tell you that the PASS, this is the shopping and cooking tasks, are very sensitive to differences in the MoCA, the standard screening measure that everybody's using now, between people who are not impaired and people who don't meet the criteria for model cognitive impairment. They're borderline, but our measures pick up that difference. The weekly calendar planning activity, the same thing. These differences between stages are statistically significant, the overall significance too. Then with Gordon's help, we've been working with therapists in a community hospital using the menu task. And the menu task is every bit as sensitive as the Medicog. So we have measures that work, that are really important, that guide treatment, that help people get the therapy services that they need if they're used. But this is the other part of the picture. This is actually data from an AOTF-funded study. Dr. Anna Boone at the University of Missouri-Columbia got a dissemination implementation grant. And as part of that project, she led a national survey of occupational therapists. This was based on, I think, 446 responses. Look at the measures that OTs are using in clinical practice. They're using the MoCA. They're using the St. Louis, the SLUMS, which is actually a knockoff of the mini mental status exam that you don't have to pay a license for. They're using clock drawing, the short blessed, and the BCAT. What's the percentage of using the Allen, which is probably one of the most widely used tests? 15%. Our colleagues are not using our measures, and because of that, they're missing the opportunity to identify individuals with functional cognitive impairments who need therapy. And they get discharged and they go home and they don't get what they need often. So how are we going to address this? We are so fortunate through that we have additional funding from the American Occupational Therapy Foundation, that we have a new study that's about to launch, and it's ideally going to address some of these concerns. We're going to be looking at all of the current functional cognitive measures, and we're going to be able to talk about score equivalency. We don't have enough of a sample size to develop norms, but we'll at least be able to create standard scores. And we're going to be using those, and we'll be able to look at performance against some of the standard, the NIH toolbox, for example. So we're going to be able to do the validation studies and also the concept and construct validity studies. And this is our group. So Carolyn and Lisa Connors from Washington University, Anna Boone and Wolf from the University of Missouri-Columbia, and Gordon and I we claim Gordon in the summers for the University of Wisconsin, and he's my co-investigator for this. But here's where I want to end. The increased use of functional cognitive assessments in OP practice gives, it's really concerning given the lack of sensitivity of traditional cognitive screening to identify impaired cognitive performance. We need to be publishing our work more broadly. It has to go into the multidisciplinary literature. We can no longer just talk to ourselves about this. We don't have a single measure that's used in clinical trials. And I think our measures are more sensitive, would be better outcome studies, but they're not there. And one of the reasons they're not there is because people don't read about them because they don't read the OT literature. We've got to push out. We need a battery of standard measures with common scoring guidelines so we can merge our data sets and enable more complex analytic approaches and develop normative data. And we need to know the everyday cognition literature, and we need to cite it. Because I believe that if we cite them, they'll cite us. Because we need to introduce our work into the larger world of functional cognition. And not only for scientific reasons, this is really important scientifically, because what we're talking about is the integration of all the underlying requirements for complex performance. It's cognitive, it's sensory, it's motor, it's in context. Those bagel bumps matter. But what also we know is that people do not get the therapy they need because the measures that they're using aren't sensitive. And that's the most important reason at all. And I am so fortunate to have met Carolyn on that day. She changed my life, she changed my career, and I changed hers as well. I'll tell you one very funny story. So I was a pretty good statistics student. After a while, 10, 15 classes, I finally got it. Carolyn went to graduate school, and she took a class in structural equation modeling. And I had to go back to school to take a class in structural equation modeling because I couldn't figure out what the hell she was talking about. And she kept saying, oh, we just do this, and we just do that. And it's like, I don't understand how to do that. So she made me go back. And we have been that kind of interactive career for more decades than I care to count. And it's been my great pleasure. 40 years, many. I never thought that this is where I would end up. I always knew my life was outside the laboratory, and I always wanted to know how to help older adults live well in context with quality of life. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards, for that great talk. Our next presenter is Dr. Elizabeth Skidmore. She was inducted into the Academy of Research in 2014. Dr. Skidmore is Professor and Associate Dean of Research at the University of Pittsburgh School of Health and Rehabilitation Sciences. She is an occupational therapist and a rehabilitation scientist whose federally funded studies examine training methods to promote long-term independence, community participation, and subsequent health after neurological illness and injury. Dr. Skidmore's research team has refined the administration of metacognitive strategy training and behavioral activation approaches in inpatient, outpatient, and community rehabilitation settings. Her team has also studied barriers and facilitators to implementation and examine intervention adoption and implementation through pragmatic trials. Dr. Skidmore consults with practitioners, health systems, and scientists representing a breadth of disciplines and serving various clinical populations, providing guidance on intervention design, specification, and fidelity. I would also like to add that she's been very dedicated throughout her career to mentoring the next generation of scientists. She's mentored herself and sought and received funding so that others could also mentor the next career scientists. Her presentation is titled, Designing for Implementation, Missed Opportunities and Lessons Learned.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here with you, people who I care deeply about and respect immensely, to talk to you about something that's been on my mind. We were given a choice to talk a little bit about our path or some current work, and I chose to split the difference and talk about a conundrum that I think we often face in intervention research, and it maybe level a challenge for myself and others to think about this differently. And so I'll tell you, my path to research really started with a clinical itch. I had a bad moment one day during a staff meeting with a neurologist and inpatient rehab. First day of a new client, we all had done our evaluations, and the speech therapist gave the cognitive scores, and the neurologist said, "Oh, okay, so nursing home placement." And I was younger and a little more fiery in those days, and I spoke out and said, "How does a test tell us that? How do we understand this is someone's future? We need to do better." And this neurologist was long-suffering, and he pulled me aside and he said, "You're always questioning, Skidmore. Maybe you should get some more training." And so that's what took me into the path of research, a compassionate physician who didn't yell at me for being a little rude in the moment, but still asking questions and encouraging that. And so what I'm going to start with this main point, and then I want to come back to it and talk about the fact that often when we think about our interventions, they show promising effects when we do small-scale, well-controlled studies under tight conditions, often without the input of those that are most impacted by those interventions. And then when we start to work with those communities to actually implement those, we don't see the same effects. And I think it's because we have not designed for implementation at the outset. When we start to understand the phenomena we're trying to address, and even in early stages of understanding intervention. So I'm going to use my own work as an example of where I missed opportunities to do that and how we have gone back and are trying to rectify that. So I was trained at the University of Pittsburgh by clinical trialists. Not a single one of them was an occupational therapist. I was trained by psychiatrists and psychologists and neurologists. And I was constantly in this tension between what they told me was good best practices in designing clinical trials versus what I really thought was more the pragmatic issues that we face in designing these interventions. But I am a good student, so I followed through with what I was taught. And we started by looking at a phenomenon. We noticed that in our inpatient rehabilitation units, people who had changes in their executive function in particular had poorer outcomes than people who did not after a stroke. And when we looked at a variety of data, one of the things that we noticed, the people with the changes in their executive function were not engaging in the rehab processes actively. Their engagement scores were lower than people without executive impairments. And when I pulled the data and I sat down with the team and said, "Why are you scoring these people low?" they said, "Oh, they're not motivated." But when we made them aware that they actually had changes in their executive function, the silent epidemic that Dorothy and others have alluded to or have put data behind, they said, "Oh, I had no idea. I just thought they weren't motivated." So it got at this issue of how do we do rehab differently to address this issue? Something funky happened with that slide, but that's okay. And the thing that I think was really interesting when we started to look at these changes in executive function and engagement is that because we were not aware of these subtle changes, we were not actively involving these people in the design and delivery of their intervention process. And that's how we came to strategy training. Strategy training is an intervention that puts the client at the center of the intervention, taps the internal expertise that they have, and then helps them uncover additional expertise to address challenges in everyday life. And so we've shown in this intervention that people actually have better rehabilitation outcomes over time. They see improvements in their executive function. We tend to see less depressive symptoms and apathy symptoms emerging in people who receive this intervention. And we've repeated this again and again in pilot study after pilot study, ends of 30 and 60 and so forth. But then when we go to test this again, and I'm really sorry, when they pulled it over, the formatting got shifted, but we saw unequivocal effects when we started to do larger studies. This was a 6-site study with 240 people randomized, and there were barely any differences in rehabilitation outcomes between the two groups. And so the question is, why? Where did we go wrong? We had piloted and thought we had this mastered. What do we need to do? So we took a step back and we took a look at our process and all the different pilot data that we had collected, all the different questions that we had asked, and we went back to this traditional linear approach to thinking about clinical trial or intervention development, right? So many of us were trained in the translational continuum. You start with a preclinical question, understanding what the problem is, what causes that problem, what are the potential mechanisms or levers that you can address that would alter the outcome of that problem, what active ingredients of the intervention address that mechanism, how can we test those together in early phase studies so that we understand that package of intervention elements, how they work and move forward, and do we see a signal in the change of the outcome of interest, and if so, we move into our efficacy trials, and then we kind of lump it together, then we test its effectiveness, right? This is how many of us were trained, and this is really a continuum that was intended to laying out a continuum between explanatory trials and pragmatic trials. So if you'll bear with me, I'm going to dive into this a bit more. Explanatory and pragmatic studies differ in the goal, design, and the intended outcome. And neither one is good or bad. They each have their purpose. They have their role. These are just tools, but I think we often misapply these tools. And so one of my mentors early in my career, almost 30 years ago, I remember him teaching me that an explanatory trial is like studying the lion in the zoo under controlled conditions where he has a stable diet and he's protected from predators and there's routine to his life, versus pragmatic trials are studying the lion in the wild, right, where anything can happen, right? And the truth of the matter is we're often wanting to prepare for the lion in the wild and not necessarily the lion in the zoo, correct? So explanatory studies are really good tools that can be used to help us understand how change occurs. That's the question they address. How did the change occur as a result of the intervention? And as a result, if you're trying to understand how change occurs, you're trying to control for any potential explanatory variables that are not the variables of interest, right? You want to control for the things that you don't care about so that you can understand how the thing that you do care about changes, right? And so this is not unlike the way many of us approach clinical intervention studies, right? We control who's enrolled in the intervention. We control how it's delivered. They're highly trained people under very strict circumstances. We control how that's happening. And so we can get at how the intervention worked, and that's fine. And there is a necessary part of that work, but it's not the whole story. Pragmatic studies examine the intervention effectiveness in the midst of variation, the good stuff. And this is where everybody in the room who are OT is like, yes, finally, scientific tools to get at things I care most about. It just took me a little bit longer in my career to get access to this. But we want to, with pragmatic trials, study how robust the change is. So how robust is it in the midst of variation? Variation in who's receiving the intervention, variation in who's delivering the intervention, variation in the conditions or the setting of how it's being delivered, right? And this is what we're aiming for, participation in everyday life and how we can best get at it. And early in my career, I was encouraged to stay away from that stuff because that's soft science. But the reality is there are good tools that are available that we just haven't taken full advantage of yet. The truth of the matter is, if we're designing interventions for implementation, we need to account for right off the bat variations among individuals, health systems or settings where our interventions will be delivered, community resources that are going to augment, that could create barriers or facilitators to the impact of that intervention, payer policies, all of these things matter. And so we need to start thinking about that even in these very early stages, even at the preclinical and phase 1 trials. And so we've gone back and taken some classes and started thinking about how to do this and operationalize it within our work. So here's this translational research continuum that I throw up, and you can see it heavily emphasizes explanatory studies. But this is why many people think that it's taking us so long to get a new idea or an innovation translated into real practice, is we're probably over-specifying explanatory elements and under-specifying what we need to do to really understand implementation and its impact. And that's what's contributing to the extended time for implementation. So the question is, how can we do this more effectively and more efficiently? colleagues at the University of Washington proposed that we really need to think about this continuum very differently. We need to think about, yes, doing the explanatory work so we understand the mechanisms of what we're aiming for, whether it's how my identity is reflected in my development as a maker, whether it's how I interface with others, doing that work, but then also make sure that we adequately specify the steps that are needed to better study implementation, how an intervention is adopted, how it's implemented, and how do we sustain that change over time. And if we're going to do that, we probably can't wait until we get to pre-implementation level work to really engage our communities. And so it's a good theme that we're hearing about before. If the goal is to better understand how people relearn activities after their stroke, let's start by understanding what people are using, what strategies they're using, what's working for them, and how they approach it, and what language they would use. And then let's adapt our interventions to come alongside, and in my case, to more actively engage our learners in the learning process. And so we can't wait until phase 4. We really need to start thinking at the earliest stages of understanding mechanism and feasibility to engage communities. And I'm using community broadly, and I'll define that a bit in a minute, but I think depending on your innovation, your community can include a lot of different partners. So we started going back and rethinking how we wanted to re-examine the efficacy of our intervention, because we had all of this robust pilot work that we had done, colleagues at other cities had done, colleagues in other nations had done, and we continued to find a similar finding. So let's see if we can understand this a bit more. And so this is really where we started to shift away from the phased model into the NIH stage model of intervention development. This was developed by Lisa Onken and colleagues to really think about this less as a linear path, but more as an iterative path, where you may iterate in and among these different stages at different levels. We had already done some good efficacy testing under controlled conditions, and we wanted to start focusing a bit more on efficacy in our actual setting of interest, our pragmatic setting, and we wanted to build better design elements to better understand that. So one of the first things that we need to do is look at our community. And I'll just tell you that can start with the partners, the clients who are participating in the services, their families, the providers that are delivering the services, their health administrators, the payers that are supporting those services. These are all different levels at which we can engage individuals. And we do want to make sure that when we do that, we embrace the full the principles of trust, honesty, co-learning, reciprocity, transparency, partnership, and respect. And it can be particularly challenging when you're working with people who have all different types of incentives or motives for engaging in that process. But it's done well when we do that multilaterally. And we want to think about engagement beyond this idea of just asking people what they think, focus groups and surveys, and move into collaboration and shared decision making. Where's the I go? There we go. I'm just going to use this. So this is the PCORI Continuum of Engagement practices, and we are very thoughtful based on the type of question that we're asking and what our intended outcome, whether we are really working at the level of input versus consultation versus moving to collaboration and true shared leadership. We are right now leading projects where we have co-PIs, funded co-PIs, with NIH BioSketches who have lived experience that are working with us to help co-design these interventions and move this work forward. So as we think about this a little bit, I'll give you some examples from our own work. We were working with strategy training, which was a distillation of the co-op approach developed by Helen Politeco and colleagues in Toronto. And there's a global strategy, goal, plan, do, check, which is a structure for helping people think about the problems they're facing and then how they might develop strategies. But as we worked with the participants in the study and asked them, what do you like about the intervention? What makes sense to you? What doesn't? They're like, I get that I need a strategy, but I don't know what you mean by goal. Do you mean the treatment plan goal? Do you mean the session goal? Do you mean the goal for this particular activity? It sounds very jargony to me. We don't know what you mean by that. And sure enough, when we went and talked to the OTs and the PTs and the speech therapists delivering the intervention, they were very confused by the word goal because we use it in a lot of different ways as well. So we asked both groups, how would you describe the strategy? And it really came from the participants in the intervention. They said, well, you have a select an activity, try it, assess and reflect, and try again. And thus we adapted our strategy to the START strategy. The other thing that we liked about this is we wanted to get people to actually practicing those new activities, learning their new normal as soon as possible. And a lot of times, sometimes they were getting stuck in the goal and planning period when they really just needed to try the activity, see what it felt like after they were experiencing their new normal, and then reflect on that experience as a result of that. And so this really achieved a couple of different things that helped us augment some active ingredients in the intervention. The other thing is it was taking us too long to train the therapist to get to a high level of fidelity, which is something you can do in controlled clinical trials, but when you're getting ready to do a 50-site inpatient rehabilitation pragmatic trial, it is not feasible. And we're getting ready to launch one, so I needed a better way to handle that. So we partnered with participants who received the intervention and their families to design an online course that involves asynchronous learning. There are some synchronous discussions. We have these web-like on chats. There's also an opportunity for the therapist to upload a video and get feedback, all with HIPAA protections and permissions accounted for, that allow us to participate in that. And they get feedback not only from our trained therapists, but also from people who've received those services to give them feedback about how to adhere to those active ingredients. So we'll go back to this trial that I told you about. We randomized 240 people, and we did not see a difference. But when we took a closer look at the data, there were a couple of really interesting things. In our pilot work, our average length of stay was around 18 to 19 days, but then there was a major policy shift. And now our average length of stay in the inpatient rehab unit, was 23 days and went down to about 18 days in the span of a very short period of time. In our pilot work, we were getting about 9 to 10 strategy training sessions that were added as an adjunct to usual care because it was an explanatory trial and we had to control for a bunch of things. But in our larger trial, we were getting only about 6 sessions in during their inpatient stay, with only about 40% of the sample getting the full 7 sessions, which our prior work had showed we need at least 7 sessions to get a meaningful outcome. So this is problematic. And this forced us to move away from traditional parallel randomized controlled trials with high control over explanatory factors and think about different approaches. So we designed a parallel wedge observational design with matched cases. Essentially what we did is we went into the hospital and we needed to embed strategy training within care rather than augmenting care. We trained an OT, PT, and speech therapist. We started by observing what their usual care looked like. We pulled a bunch of data from the medical record. We'd videotaped their sessions. We coded what we saw happening. We looked at their outcomes. We did that over 3 months. They trained about, at that time they saw about 380 participants. And then we trained them in strategy training, which really only happens about over a 10-hour period, but we spread it over 4 weeks so they could work it into their work schedule. And then we went back and repeated that observational period. And we randomized the order in which people were doing the observation versus the actual training. We matched cases based on baseline score as well as their diagnosis. And what's interesting about this, it's not a randomized trial. There are a few control variables in there for instrumental control, but it's not as powerful. But what's interesting is we're starting to get a little bit closer to implementation. So in our original pilot study, we had 30 people. We got about an average of 9 sessions. Length of stay was about 23. And you see between admission and inpatient rehab, when we terminated the intervention, we had a small effect size. The larger effect sizes showed up 3 and 6 months later. When we did this larger trial with 230 people, only about 6 sessions, and the length of stay is shorter, and you see a very minimal effect size. But in this, when we embedded it into the usual care and put in some observational controls, we actually got a much higher dose of the strategy training. We have a shorter length of stay. It's still getting shorter. It's shorter yet now, but we have a much more robust effect size in that initial window. We were unable to follow them 3 and 6 months later. This happened during the pandemic, but this was enough pilot data to go ahead and fund the pragmatic trial we're getting ready to start. We also showed significant changes in the two major active ingredients. So one of them is increasing the focus on occupation across the sessions. We saw significant increases in occupation, which is the first set of columns, significant reductions in purposeful and preparatory activities. We also saw significant improvements and increase in the use of guided discovery, significant reductions in direct skilled teaching and overall cues. So the two kind of major potent active ingredients of the intervention bore out in this model. And the therapists liked the intervention. They felt like they learned a lot more by actively engaging their clients in the planning process. It was eye-opening. I started to identify people who had cognitive impairment that I wasn't aware of, or I thought someone had cognitive impairment, but they actually did fine. It provided a structure that fit easily into their daily, and it was billable therapy. It was able to make it easier for them to figure out what clients need to actually get ready for the context of home. So we partnered with Compass Health, and we identified 30 facilities that gave us as much variation as possible geographically, as well as in terms of clinical populations, as well as socioeconomic status. We oversampled facilities so we could get a sample that would reflect the US Census in terms of population demographics. And we spent some time preparing for implementation. We did some surveys of their OT, PT, and speech therapy staff, as well as the directors of therapy operations. We also asked them some questions about their implementation culture, their learning climate, their organizational structure. And what we learned from this is that our small and medium-sized facilities, based on the average daily census, had different needs than the large facilities. And so that meant that we needed to stratify our implementation strategies a little bit differently. We did do some focus groups in this case, gathered a bunch of information about their culture, their implementation client, but also their thoughts about barriers and facilitators for employing this. And all this was supervised by an advisory group of participants who'd received strategy training, who helped us kind of identify some key themes and participate in the thematic analysis. And then we mapped these using the C for Eric matching tool, the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, Expert Recommendations in Implementing Change matching tool, which helped us identify some evidence-based implementation strategies to test. So essentially this gave us our active ingredients, if you will, for our implementation package that we're going to be testing in our next study. And then we found that generally the same implementation strategy should work for all facilities, but for small and medium-sized facilities, we need to add an additional implementation strategy that we're going to pilot under controlled conditions initially in order to tailor the strategy for those facilities. So we're now back to better understanding how we can test efficacy, and we're getting ready to do that in a more innovative design, incorporating what we learned from our community partners. And then based on what we learn, if our findings continue to bear out, then we'll start to think about moving forward in assessing effectiveness and implementation and dissemination. And when we do that, we're going to embrace hybrid designs. And so we are gathering the pilot data from this efficacy trial about better understanding the environment in which the intervention is being delivered, the preferences of the people who are participating in the intervention, and engaging that so that we can build that in and simultaneously assess effectiveness and some of the early adoption in our next trial. So I'll end with my main point, and that is we could do this more efficiently and more effectively. You all could do better than I did and learn from my mistakes so that we can do this well. I just want to highlight all the different people that have funded the work that I cited today, as well as these two. We worked with a large regional health system that covers 3 states, and then we worked with a larger national system so that we could get more variation. And last but not least, I just want to let you know, and I have some handouts if you want, I'm proud to say that I'm the lead PI of the new K-12 program. There are 2 new K-12 programs that have been funded for OT and PT scientists, junior faculty. We're partnering with Pitt, Delaware, WashU, UNC Chapel Hill, Washington University, and Colorado Anschutz to train occupational physical therapy and rehab medicine faculty scientists. And the whole focus of this will be teaching how to engage communities to design for implementation. So if you have junior faculty that would qualify, I'd love to talk to you about it. We're getting ready to recruit our first cohort. And you do not have to be in any of those facilities to participate. You can be at any university if you have a sufficiently strong mentoring group, and we augment the mentoring group from our 6 facilities, or 6 universities. So I will end there.
Thank you, Dr. Skidmore. Our final presenter, Dr. Roger Smith, was inducted into the Academy in 2010. Dr. Smith is Professor Emeritus in the programs in Occupational Therapy, Science and Technology. He was the former Program Director in Occupational Therapy and Director of the Rehabilitation Research and Design for Disability R2D2 Center at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Dr. Smith has an interdisciplinary background with degrees in social sciences, health sciences, engineering, and occupational therapy. This combined education consistently provided background for his path to discovery and his past and current projects. Dr. Smith's publications and presentations span accessibility, universal design, assistive technology, and outcome measurement. He has directed more than 40 funded projects and initiatives over the past 4 decades and has created new measures and devised interventions related to disability and rehabilitation with a focus on assistive technology. Under his direction, the R2D2 Center has prototyped comprehensive apps, creating data collection and reporting platforms for 2 key areas in health: home health for people with disabilities and aging, and community building accessibility. His presentation is titled Fundable and Publishable Research, Dead Ends Without Impact, 4 Decades of AHA. Please help me welcome Dr. Smith as he shares his inspiring journey and innovative research shaping the future of our field.
Thanks, Patti. And one of the great things about going last is I can just summarize my presentation is really just a summary of comments from all the previous 3. You will see sort of a theme of some of the things going on there, but actually, as I was sitting there, I almost decided to completely reorganize and re-implement my presentation, which I won't do, but I do want to add one thing in the front of it, and that is one of the things that the National Advisory Board for Medical Rehabilitation and Research at NIH does as a part of their tradition is when you graduate from there, the board gives you an opportunity to comment on anything you want. What would you change? What would you do? What do you wish you could do when you were, in terms of impacting medical rehabilitation in NIH? And one of the comments I made was, if you think of all of the research, all the really, really stellar research that's done across NIH and has been for decades, what is the first thing almost guaranteed to be excluded in those perfect studies? Because you have to focus, right? You've got to do that really good explanatory research. You've got to do your reductionistic thinking. So who are you going to cut out of your population of study? And you can almost look at any NIH RCT and you can see the wording. And I actually started a publication. We were going to go back and we actually got a really good database of all the studies at NIH, and we were going to actually go through and do some AI and actually build the, and actually check the hypothesis, are people with disabilities actually excluded? And you guys know, because we've written the same exclusions in to make those explanatory studies. We are excluding people with disabilities in every great study that we write. Why does that make any sense at all? Well, it's because of the methodology that we're taught. We probably should do a whole discussion around that topic. But so one of the things I was had tossed out to the board when I was leaving was, if I had a magic wand, one of the things I would do is where we have to add how we have to explain what we're doing with minorities, what we're doing with gender, what we're doing with children. Why shouldn't we have to defend not including people with disabilities? Because we're automatically, methodologically taking out samples that could be really, really helpful in seeing what's going on in real life and would explain a whole bunch of things on an exploratory basis. I'm not saying you have to include, but you're going to have a very small percentage of different types of disabilities, right? But just think of the richness of what you would get out of looking at those data. Anyway, some of the things Beth was saying, we have to rethink this whole thing of implementation science, and that's kind of what this presentation's about. If I can figure out the technology. Okay. Oh, down? We will use spacebar. No, I'll just use the arrow keys. That works. All right. So why am I here? A quick summary. Well, it's because I think they saved the oldest till last. Aging wins in this set of presentations. So I'm going to do a quick summary of the 45 years around occupational therapy and occupational science. In fact, that started when we didn't talk about occupational science very much, right? This was mentioned in the introduction, my psychology background, the social sciences, my occupational therapy background, and then my PhD was in industrial engineering. What's important here is the focus is on decision sciences and human factors engineering. You'll see that those things loop into almost all of the projects and all of my thinking. You'll see how they're connected. I tried to tackle a lot of questions. These are just some of them. I'm not going to read through them, but I do have an example of hemiplegic slings that was one of the first papers that I published. In fact, the first paper that I published in AJOT. Bunch of questions around how do you measure accessibility, how do you measure functional performance around accessibility, and then something that really is sort of a tickling of a question, and that is, what's the relationship between big data, RCTs, that's sort of a way of doing big data, AI, which depends on big data, and N equals 1 single subject designs. That's a big research methodology question that I think OTs can answer better than a lot of, maybe any field. So funding experience, I don't need to go through, but I really wanted to highlight the array of types of things that I'm pulling together for this presentation from federal agencies across them, state foundations, industry, local organizations, university funds. I think we all do that as researchers, but that's kind of what I'm bringing to the table. I've had the opportunity to sit on a lot of advisory boards at some of the prestigious institutions at center and as part of center advisories and organizations that has been really eye-opening to see where things are going, but also being able to sort of toss commentary in. So I have three pretty simple presentation objectives, sort of a sky view. I've recently retired. I'm still learning how to do that. I am definitely a lifelong learner. No one teaches you how to retire. Carolyn, do we know how to do that? Explain the importance of OT, ST, occupational therapy, science, and technology research impact, and then describes a couple examples. I thought I'd throw in some fun examples, that some of which I don't think I've actually talked about to anybody before. So rethinking that funding and publications are insufficient. Research funding, publications, and capacity building equals success, right? I mean, don't we measure all the new faculty based on those things? True, but still what? Aren't these core metrics just a means to an end? And if so, to what end? And what are the real goals as researchers? And I'll just say impact, and I think that's the theme from all the previous presentations, right? So we, OT, and occupational therapists and occupational scientists are better than traditional scholarly outcomes. I don't want to go into this, but we didn't invent a lot of these things. but we understand some of these things and articulate them better, and some of those people are in this room. We don't have that many people in the room, but some of the people who created and articulated and defined some of these relationships are here, and we understand PEO as an example better than other disciplines and professions. So what kind of impact are we good at? Maybe a different kind of impact than other professions and disciplines. Some of you know that I like acronyms, so I just threw one together. What's impact stand for? Innovations, meaningful products, actionable concepts and theories. So it's good to have a theory, it's good to have a concept, it's good to have a product, it's good to have stuff, but how do you make it actually happen? Now, I'll highlight that NSF, NIH, and NIDLR have words that they use a lot in a lot of their funding discussions. And they each had to make their own, so NSF uses transformational. And the number of times when you're doing a review and listening to the reviews in NSF, is it transformational? Are you changing the world? Are you making the next quantum or nano whatever that's going to do whatever? NIH, translational, right? And NIDLR with the whole thing of knowledge translation, and tech transfer is all in there too. But the point I'm trying to make is this impact direction is something that's really, really core among our major funding institutions. And in fact, they've been starting to increasingly fund specifically the tail end of research that is that translational piece or that transformational piece or that knowledge translation piece. And so it behooves us to be able to, when we're starting to think about what studies we're doing or what direction we're doing, how does all of that tie together? Because you want to actually figure out how are you going to be applying for those translational, transformational, or knowledge translation ones at the tail end of the continuum that you're doing. NSF started a whole new directorate not too many years ago on specifically technology, innovation, and partnerships. Okay, Roger's story number one, hemiplegic slings. About 45 years ago, I published my first paper in AOTA, and I won't go into too much detail, but basically it was a checklist for hemiplegic slings that looked at what are good things about hemiplegic slings, what are bad things about hemiplegic slings. It was a checklist for therapists to sort of think through what are they doing in practice. That was kind of nice, but so what? Maybe some people read it, some therapists read it, and maybe it changed a little bit of behavior. But the way technology transfer, I guess, sometimes works is many years later, this was the traditional sling of the time. I actually did a study of what slings were being done across the nation, and it turned out that I could round it up to exactly 100. So one of my first presentations at the American Congress of Rehab Medicine basically was a display of the 100 different slings, shoulder slings that people are using for hemiplegia or whatever. And this was the one that was certainly used the most by OTs. Anyway, decades later, at an AOTA conference, I ran into a booth in the exhibit hall, the Give More sling, made by an OT and PT team, Givler and Moore, Paul Moore, although I noticed they're not here. So either they don't need to market anymore because everybody knows what the slings are, or I think Paul retired. Anyway, they cited the checklist as the motivation for the sling design. Decades later. Wow, now that is technology transfer. That's impact. So sometimes you don't have to plan it, it'll just happen if you might be kind of going the right direction maybe. Anyway, I think the Give More sling is one of the most prolifically provided now in rehab programs. Anyway, impact decades later. And so here's a couple pictures of the Give More sling. It is a little different, it provides different kind of support. Story number two. Actually, I was the son of a Veterans Administration engineer. In the 1960s, my dad was an electromechanical engineer that worked for Hines Veterans Hospital in Illinois. They had a hallway that went forever. It was a straight hallway that went forever. It's like, talk about architectural design. Dad kept complaining that the devices he fabricated for patients as research devices were not given to patients to use for discharge. and they never made it to market. And it really frustrated him. He'd be inventing these things, and they'd been trying them out. They'd be using VA participants. And where was the technology and the transfer and the knowledge translation then? Zip, didn't go anywhere. So I figured it was PPP, prototyped, presented, and published, but not in use. And so that was the mid-1960s. I actually have some pictures of these things. A grasping, motorized grasping. So this is the mid-1960s, right? Little robotic, electronic grasping. One that included some supination, pronation. Another one that included some elbow extension, flexion. And then one with a electronic lock for prosthetics. This was about the time when Fred Salmons was actually getting going on his prosthetic stuff at the fledgling Rehab Institute of Chicago as well. Over 50 years later, now we know exoskeletons, robotics have become real. Tech transfer takes decades. Why does it take so long? No method to support technology and knowledge translation then, but now there is, so there's no excuse that if you create something like that, that you don't have a plan for how in the world you're actually going to bring that to impact. So all researchers and developers, including OTs and occupational scientists, really need to be thinking about that from the beginning. Okay, recent project number one, Hestia overview. And Hestia was actually the goddess of architecture, home, and hearth. And so we said, oh, is that great? I can come up with an acronym for that. So we put the team on it. And home evaluation system with a triangulating intervention approach. Well, you can guess what the triangulating was, probably. Anyway, over $2 million later, a software grant stream of 2 federal grants that started in 2014. How do you get it done? How do you get it done? How do you get it done? What are you going to do with it? Software was prototyped and preliminary validation testing. Anyway, currently in small business startup, yay. We've been through NSF, NIDLR, all kinds of startup programs. And we're currently in small business startup combined with one version of the software app into a service provision program with a quantitative assessment, public available 26, 27. Anyway, collaborators, Texas Women's University, University of New Mexico, Columbia University, Marquette University. As everyone says, this is a team. You really have to get a lot of people around this. Incidentally, somewhere about this time, we made some decisions that we were never going to be submitting a grant ever again that, maybe ever again. No, ever again that didn't include participative action research. Just automatically is going to include participants as a part of the process of advising and formulating and changing the projects. Very simple, it's the home evaluation. Here's just a picture of a set of stairs where you can't see the stairs. There's only banister on one side of the house. Real challenge, right, in a house like that. So what can we do? We can do a couple simple things without tearing the house down, make the steps be able to see the steps, put banisters on both sides, et cetera. So how do we get there? And so what kind of evaluation might help that happen? Some new ideas. Anyway, some observations from that project. Plan on a 10-year plus horizon for software availability. If you think you can make an app for that in a year or two, don't even keep thinking that ever again. If it's a significant app, well, yeah, if it's just an app that's going to count something or it's going to display something, but if it's a significant app, it is going to take a long time. Begin tech transfer day one, or maybe before day one. We had participated in both NSF I-Core and NIDLR Impact tech transfer programs and a third startup support incubator. We had a product in mind for impact, but be ready to change everything except maybe the core components in the product. I mean, it changed and changed and changed and changed during that process. Maybe it's that implementation science continuum that is not a straight line. It has so many iterations. When you get to the end, it may not, which will resemble your core thinking, but it may not resemble what you were thinking. So example, one of the things we did is we changed the name of Hestia. Oh, Hestia was so nice, right? Anyway, 2, My Accessible Home. Is that a little bit better for marketing and from commercialization? I think so. We think so. Anyway, but we did not lose the core theory of PEO because it still is unique to be able to intentionally figure out how are you building those 3 pieces into a model of an evaluation and implementation, even for home assessment, even though there's a lot of home assessments out there. Project number 2, overview. My first federal R&D proposal was way back in the early 90s, and it was kind of a Yelp for accessibility of restaurants. Great idea before Yelp. We could have been Yelp. No. Anyway, 5 federal agency proposals, and years later, after 4 failed attempts at 4 different federal agencies, we finally landed a federal grant in 2010. Anyway, technology changed in the meantime. We had to rewrite everything, paper and pencil, to software, to mobile apps. 4 federal grants and $2 million later with 2 technology transfer projects under our belt, and 2 in the middle of right now, again with really good, and actually one of the themes here is, did you hear me say I was retiring? I actually handed off and PI ships to our collaborators that were co-PIs to begin with, and so Columbia and University of New Mexico have been really taking the lead on a lot of this. So retirement planning, I don't know when you start that or how you learn to do that. These are actually not current slides, but it just shows the idea that makes Access Place unique. We have not changed the name yet, Access Place, but there's 3 different panels here that show, and this was actually built on real data, built on the ratings, accessibility ratings of restaurants. And it's the same restaurants. We had 20 restaurants around Milwaukee that we were looking at. And you'll notice that McDonald's, I just picked out McDonald's, and one of these is at the top, one of them is towards the bottom, and the other one's not even on it. What's going on there? Well, one of the things we were doing was putting in some AI to be able to customize the ratings for other people like me. So what happens is those are ratings from 3 different people with 3 different disabilities. Because one of the problems of measuring accessibility is every person with a disability has many different types of accessibility needs. So one thing doesn't do it all unless you figure out some different ways of doing it. And so that's what we've actually built in. So if you're blind, you might have one set of ratings. If you use a wheelchair, you might have a different set of ratings, and if you're deaf, you might have a different set of ratings. But based on the same questionnaire, the same questioning system, it's just that how do you sort through and filter the data to present it for the person who really needs it. The concept is, if you have a disability, wouldn't you like to know first what ratings other people like you rate those restaurants, as opposed to some generic or other kind of a rating. So anyway, that's kind of how those were built. Some observations. Plan on a 15-year horizon. It's growing. I said 10 years for one, now it's 15 years. Horizon for technology R&D changes. Begin tech transfer day 1. There's a little bit of discovery here. We had participated in as much as we could in terms of trying to support that technology transfer. Stay theory-based. So OT and OS theory is awesome, and we've been discovering that when we talk about what we're doing, we always go back to some of the basics and use every OT collaborative skill possible, that team-making piece that we're all talking about. The theory here, this was actually built by Jacqueline Swartz when she was doing her doctorate at UWM, which we've sort of locked onto. So you have a person with a disability that wants to get into the community, and there is a barrier, like a stairwell. Then what do? The traditional thing is, oh, well, let's get rid of those stairs, or let's not build those stairs to begin with. Of course, that is the perfect solution. Don't build it to begin with, and we want to do it that way. But guess what? There are buildings that already have stairs, or the buildings that can't get rid of stairs, or whatever else. So that is not a solution all of the time. So what do you do? So it's really an information theory. You provide people with information about accessibility so they can make decisions and plans for themselves. And so it's really a dual process, a parallel. Yes, we want to build better, but two is we also, because we know we will never have a perfectly universal designed environment, we have to provide better information to everybody so they can make better decisions. And so that's really the theory that we're using around all of this. And the person's really involved in that process as the environment is really involved in the process. And all of our questions are really occupation-based types of questions. Okay, so stepping back, given this 40 plus years in process, what do I have yet to do? Continue learning how to retire, still trying to do that. Handoff active projects, transition PIs. Thank you, Dr. Mendonça. I think Rochelle's here. Dr. Burns, I don't think Suzanne's here, at the University of New Mexico in Columbia. One issue still chides me. Actually, I had a list of about 15 things that I felt like still needed to be done, and I could hand it to you guys to take care of. But OTs understand the need for both big data and little data. Because we treat people as individuals, that's the little data. That's where it matters. That's the most important piece. But we also know that big data is needed and respected in research, and especially in this day, in the age of AI. And I want to make a little comment about AI because I have to say something from my engineering background. I wish we had a whole conversation about this because there's actually some really, really, really important things we have to say about research methodology and AI. But are you familiar with the JAMA Evidence-Based Medicine 25-part series that really kicked off the whole idea of evidence-based medicine back in the 1990s? Probably at least have heard about it. And certainly it changed research and changed evidence and how we think about evidence since then. The heavily cited hierarchy of strength was published in 1995. You know, clean RCTs were the gold standard. Gordon Guyatt was the primary author of actually the whole series. And at that time, the hierarchy, and this was in, I think, 9 out of 25 issues, they came out and said, oh, here, we're going to give you a hierarchy of research, good research and not so good research and really not so good research. And the higher, the better. Poor Dean Watkins did something like this too, after that. But what's at the top there? Clean, perfect, reductionistic RCTs, right? Now, Gordon Guyatt was mostly pharmaceutical in the way he thought. But what's really interesting is in the last issue, 25, in 2000, he reorganized the hierarchy. This never gets talked about. The hierarchy that's out there is the first one, it's elaborated on, and we see it in a lot of different incarnations. But this hierarchy is the one that they revised at the end of discovery after 25 issues of what's really important and the best evidence that's out there and what's at the top. N equals 1. So who understands N equals 1? That's what we do in occupational therapy. And so how does that fit into our research methodology is really, really, really important. Obviously, you need to sort of think through both of those and how do they fit together and what does that mean. We had a sort of I guess it was kind of a focus group, but Kat Ottenbacher was there and Gordon Guyatt was there and Neil Aldridge was there, a whole bunch of sort of pristine methodologists in our era that were sort of N equal 1 gurus. And we actually asked Gordon, we said, so what are you doing? If you think N equals 1, what are you doing with all your research? And he said, well, we don't call it single subject design because no one's going to publish that. They're crossover trials. So he publishes crossover trials, or did. And so he kind of was sort of coaching, you just need to do more of that because that's really important. Now, in medicine, you know, in some of the best journals, they do a lot of case reports and case studies. And there's a lot of the sort of problem-based teaching in the journals that way. So there's some recognition that N=1 is really, really important. Anyway, this is a really, really important study. And, you know, I've been teaching this as a really important study for a long time. But this last week, as part of the ahas for this presentation, it had a whole new twist to it. And I'll explain that to you. So from my engineering and OT perspectives, I'd love to have a full conversation about how AI relates to N=1 and big data. But I just want to leave you with this paper. Who has not read or doesn't know about the British Medical Journal paper on parachute use to prevent death and major trauma related to gravitational challenge, systematic review of randomized controlled trials? Now, we do know that systematic review of randomized controlled trials is the top of the hierarchy, except N=1 is above it. But who's not read that? We have such great methodologists in the room. So if you've read that, you know that it's, how often can you put a spoof in a really prominent journal? You know, not very often. But I don't know how they did it, but they did it. And I can't read the byline, the caption underneath this, but it says something like, there is no proof that parachutes actually prevent injury or death or whatever like that. The whole concept here was how important it is, and we have to understand methodology. Now, this was when we were doing assistive technology, and we also know in assistive technology that Medicare has not funded stuff because there wasn't a big enough RCT to show that a piece of assistive technology worked. When all you have to do is look around and you can say, I can show you it works for some people. It just doesn't work for everybody. You have to individualize who it's for. And so this N=1 is really, really important. This study is really, really important. It's got to be taught in every single occupational therapy research program and research course if it isn't. Here's the tail on this. So I took this paper and I asked AI, I said, summarize this paper. They came back and AI said, parachutes don't work. That was their conclusion. It sounds like Medicare saying the assistive technology doesn't work, so we're not going to fund it, you know. Evidence-based funding or evidence-based non-funding. Reason not to do it because we don't have an RCT. Okay, so we should not make parachutes because we don't have an RCT on parachutes. Anyway, but somehow we have to come to terms with small data and big data. And we have to figure out how all that works because our profession, our science is actually rooted in the importance of the small data, the little data of the person, yet we're trying to depend on big data to be able to do that. AI does a lot of really, really great stuff. But AI also has a lot of issues. I mean, parachutes don't work. Anyway, overall observations. Think impact from day one of the study, project, or program. Think big, very big. We had a former dean that had a slide that always said, think big. When you write a long-term objective and create a logic model for outcomes, plan on the impact, just don't write it. Always plan on the federal grant stream to impact. Do not underestimate. Our projects were 2 to 3 million before you can actually get to that point, but you have to be thinking about that stream the whole time. Necessary for criteria, for successful research or development project in OTOS is to articulate a grand vision, and I really like that word, grand vision, of truly impacting the lives of people with disabilities. We kind of have it embedded, we kind of know it, we kind of feel it, that's what we do, but I don't think we articulate that very well when we start projects. Oh, one more thing. Scott will like this. I can say that today that virtually every R2D2 Center project can be traced back to a 1985 funded project from AOTF that led to one of the first software apps in occupational therapy named OT Fact that was sold by AOTA that has been the basis of almost every one of our projects, or there's a thread to almost every one of our projects after that. So, marketing piece. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Rogers. All right. Well, help me congratulate all of our AOR presenters for today. And thank you to all of you for attending our second AOR Symposium.